Comics. Comics.
Welcome to a new episode of ORP. This time we'll be continuing our Star Wars Day discussion into some of the Disney era content. Last time we took a deep dive into Rogue One, and that required us to do a two-part episode covering both that movie and Star Wars Andor. This time we'll be covering the Andor show on Disney Plus and how well it followed up on Rogue One, including its focus on Cassian Andor. But before we dive in, Mike, did you want to share any thoughts on Andor as a series?
I do, and I don't want to start the show off on a negative note, but I have to say I just hate the title sequence. It sits there with that tiny crest and a black screen for like 15 seconds before the title ever even shows up on screen. That is just way too long for absolutely nothing to be happening on screen. I mean, I get the impression we're supposed to get the idea that the logo is approaching like a ship might on a Star Wars movie at the beginning, but they make it so dark that you can't even see the logo to know what's going on until it finally starts to turn downward. So if that's what they were going for, it was an epic fail. Either way, I find myself annoyed by it despite loving the show. I just wish there was some way to skip through it. But that bit of ranting aside, I generally like the series, and I can't wait to unpack all the goodies in it. So what do you say we get started, Steve?
Sure. The one on the opening sequence, I agree that it plays out too slow. I have a feeling they were going for something along the lines of 2001: A Space Odyssey, but it doesn't quite click. And thinking on it now, I think it's probably because it's missing the iconic music. It just doesn't flow the same way without the dun 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 dun. But
Right.
anyway, let's move on. My initial thoughts on Andor coming into it was that I wasn't certain at first it was needed. I wasn't certain that Cassian Andor was an interesting enough character on his own to carry the show, especially without K2SO to bounce off of. And K2 does not appear in the series at all, although we do see a similar looking droid briefly at one point. I wasn't sure that Cassian needed an origin story, which is pretty much what this is. Fortunately, I turned out to be wrong because this is not a show about Cassian in the strictest sense. The beauty of this show is that Andor is less about Cassian as a character and more a show about the rise of the rebellion. Cassian is the ground level view that we look at the galaxy through, and eventually his story does become front and center by the end of the first season. He sees how far the galaxy falls into the darkness because of the Empire, and what he experiences molds Cassian into the person he becomes in Rogue One. But the real story is the power plays that are being made in the shadows by both the rebellion and the Empire. Cassian just gets caught between these forces, and he has to choose a side, no matter how much he wants to stay out of it at first. It's also important to point out that what we see in Andor is a galaxy with no Jedi to protect it. This is a story with no Jedi, no lightsabers, and no Force users in sight. Because of this, we see the rebels being forced to make tough and sometimes ruthless decisions. And this is especially true of my favorite character in the entire show. And I can't wait to talk about him, but I get ahead of myself.
That was a pretty decent summary, but before we really start digging into this, I have a quick bit of info for my fellow K2SO fans out there. Just because we don't see our favorite droid in season 1 does not mean we won't see him. It has been confirmed that Alan Tudyk will reprise the role of K2SO in the show, so his appearance is most assuredly going to happen in the second season. But if I could build on what you said there, particularly about the start of the rebellion, Andor and Rogue One really show us what it's like to start the rebellion, the compromises made, the morality sacrificed, and the harsh realities of the rebellion. I'm no expert, but it seems to me that there comes a time, if not many times in a war, where you must either die on your moral high ground or fight fire with fire. Luthen Rail flat out said there are no rules from here on out. He actually intended to make the people suffer in hopes of inciting them to rebellion, which obviously Mon Mothma could not agree to, revealing conflicting goals and methods to achieve those goals within the rebellion, as we discussed in the Rogue One episode. Plus, there are all kinds of people on both sides of the empire, and most people have many reasons for their choices. Marva joined the rebellion simply because she was too old for fear to hold her back anymore. But with the rebels, we see that some people were opposed to the empire but preferred to undermine the empire from behind the scenes. Others seemed willing to fight until the time actually came to do so. What few were willing to fight all but died in their first real offensive against the empire. There was a scramble for weapons, ships, finances, and recruits, and nothing really seemed for sure. You know, they say rebellions are built on hope, and hope is about all the rebels had. With their great losses on and above Scarif and Jeddah, what little hope they had was all but crushed that day, and those few who fought to bring that hope gave all to provide it. The title "A New Hope" has never meant so much as it does now. Having said that, I would like to build on what you said about Andor showing us the burgeoning empire as well as the rebellion. It seems to me like the empire is still establishing itself, even 14 years after the end of the Clone Wars. Emperor Palpatine wouldn't even dissolve the Senate until 5 years later in Zero BBY. Also, I would like to point this out just in case there are others like me that did not know what this meant. Just like the death of Christ was a defining moment in Earth's history, leading us to count our years based upon when that happened with AD on Anno Domini, Latin for in the year of our Lord, and BC before Christ. So too was the destruction of the Death Star, the defining moment in the Star Wars universe. The Battle of the Death Star took place in the Yavin system, which is why they call it the Battle of Yavin, and that is what BBY stands for, and the dates clear up to 0 BBY when the battle takes place. After that date is counted from ABY, which is after the Battle of Yavin onward.
That's right. It shows the beginning of both sides and where they are as of 5 years before Rogue One. Chronologically, we're still a little bit before Star Wars Rebels, where the rebellion really starts to come together. But right now, we're seeing the rebellion as a loose organization of underground movements, with the Empire starting to tighten their grip on power. We also see how the Empire's decision to do that causes the rebellion to grow, but we'll get into that. From here, I want to make it clear, though, that our format for this episode will be a little different than past TV shows we've covered. We're not going to be doing an episode by episode coverage of Andor. The major story that we see in Andor are typically done in 3 episode arcs and 2 in one case. And there are 4 stories in all. So there's the origin of Cassian, there's the heist on the Imperial base on Aldhani, the prison break arc, and Cassian's return to Ferrix. The way we'll be covering it this week will be more on a story arc structure, not an episodic structure. There are a few reasons why I'd prefer to do it this way. One is that, honestly, I've already done more episodic coverage of Andor elsewhere, so I wanted to take a different approach. But the other reason is that there are several episodes where there just really isn't all that much to discuss. There just wasn't that much material there, and in the case of slow burn episodes that are set up. Also, if I'm honest, the show focuses a lot on characters that aren't that consequential, and in some cases on characters I can't stand. So to streamline the episode and focus on the important points, I think it works better to do an arc focus analysis. But before we get into that, I think we should talk about where the series started. So let's get into that.
That sounds like a good idea. But if I may comment on your approach, honestly, I think covering the individual story arcs is a better idea for our coverage of Andor. I think if we took time to break down each episode individually, this Star Wars Day episode would last until next Star Wars Day. But seriously, I believe you had a bit more on the writing side of things you wanted to share, didn't you, Steve?
I sure do. In 2017, Bob Iger had announced a number of Star Wars shows that would be appearing on Disney Plus. One of these was Andor, described as a prequel to Rogue One that would play out as a spy thriller in space. Diego Luna became the executive producer, and Tony Gilroy, who was one of the writers on Rogue One, ended up becoming the creator of the show. Other writers who were brought in included Dan Gilroy, who was Tony Gilroy's brother, and as well as Beau Willimon. Willimon, it turned out, ended up being a surprisingly big name on this show. He created the U.S. version of House of Cards, and he was showrunner on House of Cards for 4 seasons. We're talking about somebody who's fairly major here. Diego Luna also had some creative input, and he agreed with Tony Gilroy's idea of making him a refugee from the planet Kenari. According to Luna, Andor, quote, is this journey of a migrant, which to me is everything I come from. That feeling of having to move is behind the story very profoundly, unquote. So Gilroy and Luna leaned heavily into the immigrant experience, especially with a background on Kenari.
I have to say that I didn't pick up on that at all. I mean, they talk about leaning heavily into it, but really, isn't there just that he's from Canary? I mean, I didn't get a migrant vibe at all. I actually got more of like a refugee thing from him. As far as having to move around, that was a lifestyle Cassian chose, and it wasn't really moving. His home was always on Ferrix. I mean, am I missing something here, Steve? Did you pick up on what they were putting down there?
A little bit, I guess. The show tries to suggest an immigrant experience with Canary, but I don't think that Star Wars is the best place to tell that story, to be honest. The problem is that the Star Wars galaxy as a setting doesn't really have an immigration crisis in the way that modern countries today, here and now do. You have the Empire, which basically claims everybody is a citizen, as far as I can tell. And then you have out of the way systems like Ferrix, where people just go to hide. There doesn't appear to be an Imperial Immigration Bureau that regulates interstellar migration or anything like that. There are change codes that identify people, but there aren't stormtroopers telling people you can't live on Coruscant. I mean, this may be part of the reason why Cassian's story just doesn't register as an immigrant story. That's just not what it's like for people living in the Empire. So while I appreciate the intent of what they're trying to do with Cassian, it just doesn't fit in the story world.
Okay. So it wasn't just me. That was a pretty loose connection for them to make there. Though I will say that if that helped Diego Luna to look at his character that way, I'm all for it, because whatever it was he did, it worked. But I believe you had some things about the series itself to say, didn't you, Steve?
I do. The general idea behind Andor is that for the first season would take place 5 years before the events of Rogue One. It starts out before he joins the rebellion, and then it shows how he gets involved. Gilroy wanted to approach Cassian's origin with something of a film noir approach, and I kind of think that shows with the Blade Runner style that you see in the first episode. However, season 2 was intended to cover the following 4 years with a series of time jumps. And Gilroy intended to show Cassian's story as two halves of a novel. But we'll see if season 2 goes through with this approach, or if they just decide to stretch it out some more. As far as Cassian's character, Gilroy wanted to explore how Cassian becomes the revolutionary that we saw in Rogue One. Gilroy addressed this with a question. Quote, this guy gave his life for the galaxy, right? I mean, he consciously, soberly, without vanity or recognition, sacrificed himself. Who does that? Unquote. So in his eyes, Cassian doesn't really start out that way. According to Gilroy, Cassian begins as, quote, being really revolution averse and cynical and lost and kind of a mess, unquote. Cassian's arc in the Andor series is how he goes from that place to being fully committed to the rebellion, as we see in Rogue One. Gilroy also decided to expand the view of the galaxy around the 4th episode, which in my view is when the show really takes off. He particularly wanted to show Mon Mothma in a different light than we'd seen her previously, with the idea of challenging some of the assumptions about her based on the established lore. I'd say he definitely succeeded in that goal. But Mike, did you have anything you wanted to add on the production side of things?
I do, Steve. Andor has been confirmed to be 2 12-episode seasons, with the second season leading directly up to Cassian Andor's first appearance in Rogue One. That is particularly cool because it does much the same thing as Rogue One did for A New Hope, basically linking Andor to Rogue One, which links directly into Episode 4, which makes a really long pre-title sequence, as we talked about in the Rogue One episode. So this is definitely in the spirit of Rogue One. Well, with one exception. We talked about in the Rogue One episode about all the callbacks and Easter eggs in the Rogue One overall. I mean, over the whole film, even some that we found a little bit maybe too on the nose. But one of the decisions made very early on in the production of Andor was that the series would avoid fan service, and the legacy characters and references to other Star Wars stories would only appear if they were necessary to the story. This was because producer Tony Gilroy wanted to make the series feel real, especially by focusing on the lives of civilian characters and on dramatic storytelling. Unlike The Mandalorian, The Book of Boba Fett, and Obi-Wan Kenobi, which used stagecraft to create virtual landscapes and locations, that technology was not used on this show. Instead, much like Rogue One, real large-scale sets were built at Pinewood, and much of the filming took place on real locations in England and Scotland. Also, just like Rogue One, Andor makes a callback to the Dark Forces game from 1995 that we talked about last week in our Rogue One episode. Cassian's blaster is a Briar pistol, which was introduced in Dark Forces, a game that was set in the non-canon Star Wars Legends continuity. But with the release of Star Wars Battlefront in 2015, the Briar pistol was adapted into the official canon. This marks the first live-action appearance of the blaster. The prop was based on the K-16 model that appeared in the games, but after prop designers added some extras, it was given the name MW-20.
The Briar Pistol is a cool weapon to give Cassian. It also dovetails very nicely into my theory that Cassian Andor was meant to play the Kyle Katarn role in Rogue One. Giving Cassian the same weapon that Kyle Katarn uses in Dark Forces is a nice little connection between the two, and it really works. But for now, let's get into the first arc of Andor. The first arc is the most slow burn of the entire series, and it's also the clunkiest in terms of the execution, in my view. In fact, the first 2 episodes are probably the worst episodes of the show for me. So if you can get through those, I will say that Andor gets progressively better from there until you get to the season finale. But there are definite issues with the setup, and we will eventually touch on those. Still, I thought that the opening scenes with Cassian on Morlana 1 were generally good. There is a narrative problem with how he ends up there and why, and I do want to talk about that, but the scenes themselves are cool. I loved how Morlana 1 as a planet looked. I like the idea of a corporate planet under contract with the Empire, and I liked Cassian's confrontation with those Rent-A-Cops as he made his escape. But what did you think of that sequence, Mike?
Well, when Cassian goes into the brothel in Morlana 1 and those 2 guys, Kravis and Verlo, who were being ignored by the matron, I don't think there was any way that could have been handled where it didn't go down the way it did. Let me share a situation that can happen to a guy when he's walking on the yard. You're walking along and you look up and the sun is in your eyes. The next thing you know, some guy is asking you what you're looking at. You say nothing because it was just the sun in your eyes. Next thing you know, him and his friends are stepping to you and the guy's asked, so you think I'm nothing then? Next thing you know, you got missing teeth, broken ribs, and 16 puncture wounds in your torso from a shank. Basically, you're walking along, minding your own business, and shit just blows up in front of you, and there is no way to stop it. Well, there is. You walk around looking at the floor or the ground all the time to avoid making eye contact with random people, which you'll note that Cassian tends to do. My guess is the writers either have themselves or known someone who has served time, and Cassian served time to himself, they wrote that into his character. I also think he recognized the spirit of Kravis and Verlo from having dealt with their kind inside. I mean, Cassian could have pointed out that he had only looked at Kravis because he was staring at him. Cassian could have also added that he just told the matron that she should serve Kravis and Verlo first as they had been here longer, but the matron clearly has an issue with them. So not only did Cassian not have a problem, he just tried to help them out. But when you're talking about people like Kravis and Verlo, there really is no reasoning with them. And I imagine that only worsens when they are drinking and impatiently waiting. I mean, their concept of reality was obviously a little twisted. They kept talking about how he was laughing at them, and he's never even so much as cracked a smile.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that take. I don't think Cassian had any choice but to do what he did, to be honest. He didn't go seeking out trouble. He was actively trying to avoid the attention of the 2 Rent-A-Cops. He just wanted to lead on his sister. But the cops were harassing him because they didn't like that Cassian was getting better service than they were. They weren't taking no for an answer, and they were flat out abusing their authority to shake him down. The most questionable thing that Cassian does is the whole sequence is shoot that one cop in the face once he's down. But even there, I don't know that he had any other choice. It wasn't like Cassian was likely to get a fair hearing from the cops at that point. But I think you had a point you wanted to make about the alleyway fight.
I do actually. I have an issue with how the whole scene in the alleyway was done. The guy searching Cassian was behind him. Try to picture this in your mind. The guy searching Cassian was behind him. When Cassian grabbed the gun in the other guy's hand, it was off to his left. He pushed the gun down into the alleyway in front of him. The shot fired forward down the alleyway. The other 2 shots were fired into the ceiling. The point is that at no time was the gun even pointed towards the guy who was supposedly shot in the struggle behind him. Either way, we get a situation that is similar to what we got in Rogue One when we first saw Cassian. Similar in that he was forced to kill someone that he didn't want to have to kill. You can see him convincing himself that he had no choice but to blast that guy in the face. Just one of many times Cassian sacrifices himself, even if it was not yet for a greater cause. At that point, it was because Cassian was hiding from the law and a wanted man of the Empire, even before he killed those 2 Primor Authority officers.
That's a good catch, and it sounds right to me. Cassian is a wanted man from day one, and all over a fight he couldn't even avoid. So let me get into what doesn't work about all this. I think probably the biggest problem with this whole setup, and indeed with Cassian's arc in the whole series so far, is the entire angle with the sister. The entire quest to find her is handled inconsistently, and it adds little to the overall story. I mean, she's only brought up when it's convenient to get Cassian somewhere, and when it's not, she's completely forgotten about. I feel like Cassian's quest to find her should be a bigger deal than it ultimately ends up being, but for the most part, it's dropped when Cassian needs to be somewhere else. Finding her is the reason Cassian ends up being hunted by the Corpos and later by the Empire, but we never see what happens to her, and even Cassian forgets about her midway through. I just feel like there was potential here, and it was wasted, at least in the first season. But what were your thoughts on it, Mike?
That does seem to be an issue with the series, at least in the first season. All we know about what happened on Canary is that there was a mining accident and everyone died. Cassian told Jyn Erso that he had been at war. He had been in the war since he was 6 years old. That kid we saw in the flashbacks was nowhere near 6 years old. So unless Cassian was lying to Jyn, we have to believe that the Canarian struggle against the Empire had been going on for years. Perhaps when the Empire came to Canary to strip mine it. We see Cassian stop to look at the strip mining the Empire was doing or did there. And I couldn't help but wonder what it must have been like seeing what they were doing to the land for a native of the planet like that. I also have to assume that is why they went to the crash ship ready to do battle if need be. They were not concerned at all for those who lay dying or dead on the ground. They simply checked to see if they were living to determine if they were a threat. It would seem that the animosity went both ways. The guy that got up immediately opened fire on the leader of the tribe. So perhaps that is what he meant when he referenced fighting them at 6. Cassian told another guy that he went to the SIPO Youth Center when he was 13, and that was why he recognized Arvel Skeen's jailhouse tats. Considering Cassian was 9 when Marva took him from Canary, it would seem that they made it about 4 years together before he ended up in the SIPO Youth Center, which is a nice way of saying jail or sometimes prison for minors. Cassian tells another person he was recruited into the Imperial Army when he was 16 when he was released from the Youth Center, although he only served as a cook and deserted after 6 months, despite Cassian's lies to the contrary. In fact, being that we know that Cassian lies to embellish his past to make himself look better, I have to wonder how much of what we know about him is true at all. But back to Cassian's sister. She was back in the village, and that's where everyone else goes when Cassian stays behind to trash the ship. Without the show specifying what the issues were between the villagers and the Empire, or even if they have come into contact before, we're left to kind of put the pieces together ourselves. But they do basically drop the story, and I have to hope we're going to get some answers in season 2.
I hope so as well. It's definitely true that what we see in the flashbacks don't add up with what Cassian says in Rogue One. Unless there's other situations before this where Cassian and his tribe had fights with the Empire, and we just haven't seen them yet. They do make you do a lot of the work on the show and piecing things together, especially given how much Cassian embellishes things. And that's part of the problem with these scenes. I mean, in the end, the scenes focusing on Cassian's past don't really shed as much light as you might think. Part of the problem is that the way the scenes are shot just are not told clearly. Everything being said is in Cassian's native language on Canary. It'd be one thing if the scenes of young Cassian has English subtitles with understandable dialogue or anything that makes it clear what's going on in these scenes. I mean, I'd even have taken a protocol droid that can translate Canary, but we don't get anything like that. And we don't get anything that gives us context for these scenes. And we're meant to guess based on what we're shown. I get the feeling that they're just trying to be clever with these scenes, but it just didn't work for me at all.
Yeah, it didn't work for me either. I honestly picked up very little in that as well. I mean, there was Cassian's response to looking at the strip mine I already mentioned, and that Cassian was clearly considered less than by at least some in the village. Cassian took the markings of the leader when she allowed him to take a place in the circle. I think that perhaps that bond is why Cassian might have wanted to trash the ship after seeing the leader carried away. I don't know. But I believe you had a bit more to add there, didn't you, Steve?
I do indeed, and it leads into another issue that I have with this arc. I find it hilarious how everyone seems to figure that Cassian is from Canary, and that this is somehow meant to identify him somehow. It really doesn't. Humans are common throughout the galaxy, and there are no identifiable differences between humans from different planets, as far as I can tell. Cassian literally could be from half the planets in the known empire, and nobody would be able to tell on a glance. He could easily say that he came from Tatooine or Alderaan, and nobody would be able to say that he's not. It's laughable. I also add that Diego Luna isn't exactly the first Hispanic to play a major role in a Star Wars film. I mean, Jimmy Smits had him beat by almost 20 years, so that's not a convincing way to identify Cassian in the slightest. It's just ridiculous that anyone would think that Cassian being from Canary would mean anything at all. The whole thing reminds me of when I lived in Texas and I'd see the local crime reports on the news. I mean, most of the time, the suspect would be listed as a Hispanic male. Well, yeah, that's a good half of the people in town, guys. Can you narrow that down a little? I mean, good luck finding Cassian with a description like that. And that's leaving out the fact that the corporate cops in these episodes are a complete joke. But before we get into that, do you have anything to add, Mike?
I suppose I have some to add to that. I found it weird that they had to keep it a secret that he was from Canary. The planet was all but unknown, and the official story was that there was a mining accident and everybody died. My guess is that the Empire saw the arrows in their men and killed off all the villagers is probably closer to the truth. But we don't know if that's what happened or why they would still be looking for a boy from Canary. How would they even know he was missing? There were no living witnesses, and if they killed off the village, then why would they assume that the job wasn't done already? And nobody was going to talk as they were all dead. So even the Canary connection doesn't make sense to me, and is another thing I hope they will clear up in season 2.
Cool. So it seems like we're on the same page with that point then. My guess is that Marvel wanted to hide Cassian's criminal record, and the easiest way to do that was by claiming he was from somewhere else. But again, they make you do the work of the show to try to make sense of these points. But let's move on to the next piece of the puzzle. The main antagonist of the first arc is a character I just ended up loathing, and every time I see him, he irritates me. That character is Cyril Karn, who starts off as the main lieutenant to the chief inspector of the Morlana Rent-A-Cops. Now, if I hated this character because he was good at being evil, I could at least respect that. You have characters you love to hate sometimes, and there are times you want that in a story. Moff Gideon from The Mandalorian, for example, is a love-to-hate villain. I mean, he's just so good at being bad, and he's so despicable that it makes you want Mando to kill this guy. But Cyril Karn, I hate because he's unapologetically dumb. I mean, so let's get into everything I hate about Cyril Karn, who we call Captain Tool on Sloppy Spoilers. And boy, does he earn that name. Let me count the ways. Cyril is stupid and inflexible at every turn, and his actions just make things worse for both himself and the people around him. Now, to be fair, I can respect the concept behind Cyril. I mean, he's supposed to be the Inspector Yavere to Cassian's Jean Valjean. That's fine. He's the guy who's doggedly chasing after Cassian in the name of the Empire, a guy who's obsessed with law and order. And that would be fine if he didn't go about it so stupidly and so destructively, or even if he learned anything from his failures. But he never learns anything, and his continued pursuit of Cassian causes more and more problems as he digs himself a deeper hole. And the worst of it is that there's no plot. If Cyril just had the sense to listen to his superior and leave well enough alone. He's ordered by his boss to drop the inquiry into Cassian. And the chief inspector is right to give that order. I mean, he reads Cassian's situation accurately, can correctly reasons that the cops were at fault, and he thinks that burying the case is best for all concerned, which it is. Moreover, the chief inspector warns Cyril, also correctly, that pursuing the case has political consequences, especially with an impending imperial inspection. Had Cyril obeyed his orders, as he should have done, then he'd probably still be working at Morlana right now. But for some inexplicable reason, Cyril cannot let things go, and he sets up an illegal operation on Ferrix to apprehend Cassian, which is pretty much the most stupid thing he could do. And the operation turns out to predictably be a disaster. He loses several of his men. A number of townspeople on Ferrix get needlessly killed too, including the guy who ratted out Cassian. I mean, his actions end up triggering a revolt, and on top of that, they fail to get Cassian. I mean, Cyril's handling of the operation is so bad, in fact, that the disaster on Ferrix is used as an imperial justification for taking over Morlana, just as the chief inspector had warned him. And even after all that, Cyril thinks his actions are justified, and it's Cassian who's at fault. Cyril Karn pretty much is a textbook example of a lawful stupid character who thinks he's lawful neutral on the D&D alignment system. And here I need to differentiate what I mean by lawful stupid as opposed to lawful neutral. There are good ways to write lawful neutral characters. Look at Judge Dredd, for instance. Dredd is inflexibly devoted to the law, and he'll do terrible things in the name of the law at times. But here's the thing. Dredd is not an idiot, and he learns from his setbacks. I mean, Cyril wants to be Judge Dredd, but he refuses to see the consequences of his decisions, much less accept them, and people die pointlessly because of it. The disaster on Ferrix is completely on Cyril because he's the one who signed off on an illegal and poorly planned operation against his boss's direct order. None of this needed to happen. People are dead because of Cyril, and he never owns that. Even by the end of the season, he still won't accept responsibility for the orders that he gave. That is lawful stupid to me. And Cyril Karn is perhaps the dumbest example of lawful stupid that I can think of off the top of my head. Captain Tool completely earns my hatred and my contempt for these 3 episodes alone, and nothing he does in the rest of the season redeems that to me at all.
Just as a quick point before I go on here, you mentioned that he never owns that. But what's interesting is that he clearly stood there just baffled, like he couldn't believe what had happened when that bomb went off. Like that, the guy had to drag him away from the scene. But even with that impact, he still didn't grow from it.
Yeah, exactly right.
So yeah. I suppose that I can agree with your assessment there. At the same time, I can see what he was thinking. Cops are a gang just like any others, even Primo Authority. The hammer absolutely has to be dropped if one of their number is attacked or killed. That's just gang survival. People have to know that hurting or killing, hell, even touching one of them is acted upon with swift and severe street punishment. That needs to be seen as guaranteed, or the safety of every officer and soldier is at risk. You do not want to be seen as a punk or an easy target because you just sweep things under the rug. While Cyril did not handle that well, I have no problems at all with how Cyril felt about the situation. It was indeed way more important than anyone but Cyril and Sergeant Linus Moss was treating it. Again, I'm not saying he went about it the right way, but why he had to do it seems very clear. He may not be the brightest of guys, and I do wonder how he even acquired his rank, but I can certainly see his position.
That's a fair take, I think. He just gets too obsessive about it later, but that's more of an issue in the later episodes. So now that I've gone into my most hated character on this show, let's talk about my favorite character in Andor, and that is Luthen Rael, played by the great Stellan Skarsgård. Episode 3 is where Andor turns a corner and it starts gradually getting better, and Luthen Rael is a major part of the reason why. This guy is just so good at every scene that he's in that he's honestly become one of my favorite characters in all of Disney Star Wars, and that's saying something. Every time he shows up, it's usually because he's either doing something awesome or planning something awesome. And Skarsgård's delivery is always great to watch, whether Luthen's acting in the shadows as a rebel operative or playing one of his many cover identities. Luthen's presence on the show, I think, elevates the whole thing because he's the character who's pulling the strings behind a lot of what's going on in Andor. And as it turns out, Luthen Rael is a magnificent bastard on an epic level, and that's saying something given that this franchise has given us devious schemers like Palpatine and Thrawn. When Luthen shows up, he's posing as a buyer who's trying to purchase an Imperial Starpath unit that Cassian had boosted. But as the scene goes on, it's becoming clear that what Luthen is really interested in is recruiting Cassian into the rebellion. I like the way that they show the subversive kind of a scene a bit, because my first impression was that Luthen would end up being Cassian's mentor, and it might be that he'll still be that in season 2. But at this point in their relationship, Cassian doesn't really want what Luthen's selling. And he's mainly interested in just getting his share rather than fighting for the cause. Now that I look back on this episode, I think this shows that Luthen is flexible in the way he deals with people. He comes in wanting Andor as a recruit, enough to expose his own presence, but when he realizes that Cassian is still too self-interested, Luthen adapts his plans. I think he decides that if Cassian isn't interested in the cause, there are still ways to use him in the short term. And in the end, he ultimately has to do that because the Corpos force his hand in their pursuit of Cassian. A lot of what we see in this episode is Luthen testing Cassian, both in his character and in his skill set. And right now we see that Cassian is still very much an unrefined asset, as much as he may have natural talent. On the other side, it's clearly that Cassian doesn't trust Luthen at first, and honestly, that's a rational reaction. Luthen really should not be trusted by anyone, especially when it turns out he's lying about why he's there. But at that point, Cassian really doesn't have any other option but to go along with whatever Luthen's selling to him. The first 2 episodes were slow burn, and they made missteps, but the Luthen Cassian scenes in 3 are enjoyable enough that we start to see the show visibly improve just on their own. But Mike, what are your impressions of Luthen and his debut in episode 3?
Well, I have to agree with you. I got the impression both in these first 3 episodes and in later episodes that Luthen always intended to use and then dispose of Cassian. I knew he was playing games when he offered Cassian 1,000 more credits. 1,000 more credits. Say that to tell him how he got the device. That seems a little ridiculous right there. But then when it came time to count his money, which was likely not enough, Luthen then needed to think about whether he was going to give Cassian the money at all. I spent my time on the streets, and I can tell you that was a scam from minute one. If it was not, Luthien would have at least let the money be counted to verify that he even had the money he claimed to have. Luthien may have a righteous goal, but he has lost all connection to humanity because of it. Everything and everyone is merely a means to an end, and lives lost are insignificant by comparison. I do, however, get that to win a war, terrible things must be done. But the second you sacrifice your own morality to gain those victories, you become like the very people you're fighting against. At that point, you have lost the war, no matter how many victories you gain, because your enemy has turned you into them.
Yes, I think that is definitely possible and even likely. Luthen regards nearly everyone as players on a chessboard, and he's always weighing their value and whether they're worth risking. He'll protect those who have value to the cause, but he'll throw anyone to the wolves if he sees them as expendable, as we see later. Luthen initially seems to think that Cassian is a disposable asset, understanding the potential risk of the Aldani mission, but it probably also is that he thinks that Cassian might be able to turn the odds in the mission's favor as well. I think Luthen does eventually reevaluate Cassian again, but we'll get into that when we talk about the later episodes. Before we move on, let's give our overall thoughts on the first arc. The first three episodes of Andor are honestly the weakest in the season to me. The first two episodes especially can be incoherent and do things that don't make a ton of sense. I also wasn't attached to most of the characters on Ferrix, at least at that point, in addition to Captain Tool and his sidekick that I ended up dating for the wrong reasons. However, by the time you get to episode 3, you start to see where the show is going, especially when Luthen starts setting his plans for Cassian into motion. I will say as well that I can respect a show that continually improves in quality as it goes, and Andor certainly does that. If you can get past this arc, Andor really becomes an entertaining show as it gets the kinks out over time. But what are your impressions on these episodes, Mike?
Other than the things we've talked about already with the planet Canary and Cassian's sister, I just didn't have the problems with the first 3 episodes that you did. It was a slow burn intro, and there's a couple of dead threads in it, but I liked the first arc overall. I did not get overly attached to any of the characters my first time through, so I can understand that. But I watched each arc a couple of times after watching the whole series once. And so I feel like I did get attached to some of the characters through the rewatches. Bix, for instance, and Marva. Hell, even B the droid. By the way, I love that the word emo is built right into B2EMO's name because he is totally an emo droid. Honestly, realizing that made me like the character even more. However, I will say in agreement with you that the series got significantly better from this point on.
Cool. Yeah, B2 Emo was a hilarious name for a droid, and he does live up to that name. I don't know what it is with Disney Star Wars, but some of their best characters are very often the droids. K2SO, Chopper from Rebels, BB-8, the IG droid from Mando, and now B2 Emo. As for the others, Marva grew on me slowly through the season, and she gets that awesome moment in the finale, so I'll definitely give you that one. But I think there was someone else you wanted to mention too, Mike?
I do, Steve. I have to agree about Disney's droids in general. They do end up being great characters more often than not. But as you said, there is someone else I wanted to mention, and I will admit that I might be simply projecting this here. But time after time, I ended up with this impression. I want to talk about Tim Carlo, Bix's boyfriend in the series. I think that Tim is ignorant of what love is or means, based on my personal experience. The first time I thought I was in love when I was 17, I recognized some of his behavior. His whole outlook and on his and Bix's relationship is entirely narcissistic, and that he doesn't actually love Bix, but rather how Bix makes him feel about himself. Let me explain this. His love was not for her as a person. I mean, he may have liked her, but she was merely a part of an equation to get that feeling he loved about himself. It can be mistaken as love because it involves another person, but love puts the other person first and does what is best for them. But Tim reported Cassian out of jealousy and opened up a whole hornet's nest of crap that culminated in his death. I submit that morning when Bix woke up and Tim was just staring at her that he was worried he might lose that feeling he has about himself if Bix finds out what he has done. Again, if it was love, he should have confessed, but he further hides it. In my opinion, Tim perceived the world and those in it as if they revolved around him. That's why he ran into that blaster from the Primor officer. Self-importance. I mean, I can think of no other reason to run into a blaster with no weapons. There was no hope of surviving that to any rational person, and there was no hope of saving Bix in that situation. The only logic I can apply to that is that he believed himself of such importance that his mere protest would be enough to stop them and they wouldn't dare shoot him. But there is one alternative theory when it comes to Tim. Maybe he does love Bix and not just what she can do for him, but if that's the case, he's just a straight up dumbass with naivete on the highest order in regards to the Empire.
I can't rule that out. I can't rule it out at all. Anyway, I wasn't overly impressed with Tim at all either, and I ended up not liking him much by the end. I think you're probably on the mark about his immature idea of love and how it's ultimately self-interested. He's also emotionally insecure as well, not really giving Bix the space or the trust that a more secure person would probably offer her. It's really by that insecurity that leads Tim to selling out Cassian. And that made me think even less of him, to be honest. By the time he gets shot in the street, I just didn't feel too bad for him at all. In any case, I feel like Cassian had a more substantial relationship with Bix, especially by the end of the season. But before we can get into that, I think we need to see how Cassian grows from here.
They definitely made a huge connection by the end of the series. And actually, I have a question about some of the things Bix says on that ship. But we will get into that when we talk about episodes 11 and 12. So why don't we get into the next 3 episodes, Steve?
Sounds like a plan. It's in the second quarter of the season that we see the camera angle widen across the galaxy. Luthen Rail actually becomes less of an overt presence here, though his influence is still felt on a wider scale. We learn about who he associates with, we understand a bit more about his network, and we see a bit more of his methods. But he's not really the focus of anything that's going on beyond the initial setup, at least, getting Cassian to the next place that he needs to go. The main story of the second arc is about Cassian's first operation, where he's acting as a mercenary involved with a small rebel cell that's led by Vel Sartha. Vel seems to not be that important at first, but as the season goes on, we see that she's much more deeply connected than she lets on. We'll talk about that when we get to the later arcs, but here Vel is the leader of a small rebel operation with the goal of stealing the quarterly Imperial payroll on a planet called Aldani. So the story that we get is partly a heist caper, partly something along the lines of Rogue One, which feels like a World War II movie at times. This storyline rides the line between those two things, while also introducing Cassian to different perspectives out in the wider galaxy. Did you have anything you wanted to add before we really dive into the next 3 episodes in detail, Mike?
Just a couple of things. The scope of things definitely gets bigger in this story arc, as you say. We see that the success of the heist was almost as crucial as retrieving the Death Star plans. It puts Cassian Andor as a major, albeit reluctant at first player in the start of the rebellion, as he took a big role in all of it. I mean, he has connections to the war that go all the way back to the Clone Wars, which is why I think there was more to Cassian choosing the name of his father, Clem, than nostalgia. I think that when they hung his father in the streets, that's when he fully turned against the Empire, even if his fight was being more of a nuisance to the Empire at that point. I think Luthen's speech moved him and maybe even challenged him to prove he wasn't just a guy putting up a front. He chose Clem, in my opinion, because if he was going to start down this path, it was going to be because of what happened to his father and the cruelty of leaving his corpse to hang and rot for all to see.
That's a very good line of thought there. And while I hadn't deeply considered the question of why he took the name Clem, it works. Clem is very much on Cassian's mind in the last 2 episodes even, so his death clearly weighs quite a bit on him. So I can go along with that idea. From here, though, let's get into the characters we meet in this arc. So I'll be honest, I wasn't really taken with Vel's squad in these episodes for the most part. Most of these characters just didn't stand out to me, or at least feel like characters that were hugely meaningful at first. Now, I end up being wrong about this in the case of Vel, who does turn out to have a very interesting background later. But not knowing anything about her at that point, I mostly just shrugged my shoulders even with her. The one character I did end up liking a lot was the kid, Nemec. I thought that it was interesting that you have this idealistic young kid who truly believes in the rebellion, but not in the usual way. Nemec has a genuine philosophical understanding of what freedom is. And in some ways, he's more mature than you'd expect of his kid that age. I mean, as opposed to somebody like Luke Skywalker, who just wanted adventure and excitement and didn't really think about the larger issues starting out. I kind of felt like Nemec had fully thought out his ideas pretty well and developed his belief system into something workable. I thought that was really cool. But in other ways, he's still a naive green recruit. The problem is that while he's a good political theorist, he's not a soldier, and he has no idea what civil war is asking him to sacrifice. While he might be mentally prepared for the idea of sacrificing for the cause, he has no idea what that cost actually entails. So while I liked him as a character, I kind of felt like his naivety would be the undoing from the start, really. And I was fully expecting him to die at the end of the arc, which sadly ends up being the case. Mike, what were your thoughts on Vel and her squad? I mean, did you have any favorite characters or anyone who stood out to you? And how well do you think they worked in this story?
Luthen clearly wanted Cassian because he was a pilot. I say this because that was his stressing point when talking to Vel Sartha about adding him to the team. What's more is that she and her team knew she was short a pilot for their heist to even get the ship in the air that they were planning to escape on. Everyone who knew about the plan also seemed to know that they were short a pilot, yet they were still reluctant to accept him. My guess is just general paranoia about the potential spies of the Empire, which all rebels seem to be afraid of, that was causing this response, all except for Arvel Skeen, who was paranoid mostly because he himself had something to hide, and that led him to be suspicious of everyone else. Also, they initially keep trying to sell Clem as a critical redundancy for the team, which is only true in theory. That would be what he would do, I mean, up until the point that the pilot was required, but they don't even allow for that. Someone who is intended to be a crucial redundancy would have to have everyone's parts memorized and practiced in order to jump into any position if the need arose. But there was not just secrecy about the mission in general. Bell could not divulge the whole plan without breaching security. Bell straight up says they always knew they were short a man, and yet they intended to go through with the plan anyway. I think we can infer from this that she knew the plan would fail, and I'm guessing that this is why Luthen was shutting them down. But again, why push the critical redundancy angle alone when Cassian being a pilot was the main reason he was brought on? The very guy that set the team up is giving them the answer to the problem, and they resist because Clem hasn't been out there suffering with them all this time. That's just some petty ass shit. I would think the success of the mission would be priority one.
You'd think so, but these little disputes show how they're not a serious operation, not on the level of what the alliance becomes later, certainly nowhere on the level of Lupin and his network. I think Luthen probably felt that the plan would likely fail, and he decided to give them a better chance of success by recruiting Cassian. And like we said previously, odds are that Cassian was considered disposable, someone who's an acceptable loss if he dies, but who could be an asset if he succeeds. But at this point, Luthen doesn't have much luxury in his choice of assets, and he has to use who he has. So he's willing to take a chance on these people. Not to mention that Luthen gets out ahead no matter whether they win or lose. But what the squad doesn't realize is that they're in the same boat in terms of their options. They need a pilot. Clem's who they got. They can't just swap him out with somebody else or bring him in as a new recruit. I mean, the difference is that Luthen sees the big picture and he's willing to work with whoever gets him ahead. But too many people in Vel's squad are still bickering over the small things and not seeing two more important things: what they stand to lose if they fail and what they stand to gain if they succeed. I think the reason Nemec bothered me less than the others is that he seems to understand this. He's willing to work with the people who choose to help them no matter what their reasons are.
That's a good observation, actually. The one person who truly understood what was at stake was not qualified to go on the mission. The others, as you pointed out, were qualified for the mission, but had no understanding of what was at stake. The leader, Vel, seemed more interested in getting credit for what she was doing. You'll notice that she was only willing to go with Clem's obviously better plan when he said she could take credit for it. She's like, oh, well, okay then. And then when Belle goes to Luthen's antique store, the first thing she tries to do when she isn't being treated like the Queen of fucking Sheba by Clayla Markey is pull the top secret mission out as bragging rights. I gave him all Donnie. What have you done lately? That mission was more about her ego than the cause. And honestly, I think she was in over her head, and it was the skin of her teeth that saved her. She didn't seem to be the greatest leader, and it was like she was just winging it. I mean, when it came time for her to make that jump, she froze and put the team behind schedule because of it. If I'm honest, I think desperation of Lucen was what put her in charge, and it was Clem that saved her ass. But I'll elaborate more on that in a minute. But there is one thing I noticed about Vel that was not necessarily obvious in this particular arc, but would be confirmed, at least in my impression, later on. So there are a couple of times that Clem starts to have a moment with Cinta Cass. The first is when Cinta is helping Clem get dressed, and Vel makes a point of saying that Clem can dress himself. When that happened, I assumed that I assumed that Belle was just trying to stop any fraternizing between the members of her team, because things can go bad if two members of the team's relationship takes a left turn. Then there was the night before the heist when Clem was handing Cinta what I'm assuming was Nog, and they shared a look for in a brief moment before Belle steps in between them. When she stepped in between them, I totally got a jealousy vibe from her there. And then I remembered that the team actually looked to Cinta to see if Belle had told her about Clem, and things actually start to fall into place. The two of them were clearly close, so the team would not have looked to Cinta for that answer. Then, while they were on the heist, Belle holds Cinta's hand and says, "Tell me you'll be all right." And Cinta says, "I'll be fine. Go." That that really seemed to suggest that they were lovers, and explains Belle's reactions previously.
Oh, I got the same reaction, and that is definitely semi-confirmed by scenes between them in later episodes. I say semi-confirmed because at no point does anyone openly go out and say that they're a couple. But Vel and Cinta definitely behave like they're a couple, both here and in the later stories where they interact. On top of that, there's one later scene where Vel is on Coruscant, and a particular character alludes to Vel not being married, unaware of Cinta's existence. If Vel and Cinta are not a couple, that point has no weight at all in the context of that scene. So my view is that they definitely are an item.
I was actually hoping you would tie that in that comment about her not being married and refusing to get married. That was the part where any doubt in my mind about her and Cinta was gone. But let me talk about that scene for just a second, because it at least implies some things about Chandrillin customs. I couldn't help but notice Perrin teasing Vel about finding a husband. I got the impression he knew exactly why she had not married a man. Plus, you'll notice that Mon Mothma gives Vel a knowing look when Perrin teases her, and Vel looks obviously uncomfortable. You kind of have to put these pieces together, but follow me here for a second. Perrin and Mon Mothma were betrothed and married at a very young age, as is the Chandrillin way, as they said. If you connect that with Perrin teasing Vel and likely knowing her sexual orientation, it seems to imply that Chandrillins are expected to marry young, and that perhaps same-sex relationships are frowned upon, or even banned. At least that would explain why Vel appeared to be so uncomfortable. But what do you think of that?
I think that's very much the case. Chandrila seems to be very much a traditional society, probably built on very strong cultural, maybe even religious beliefs. While we've never seen that much real discrimination in Star Wars aside from prejudice against aliens, it does seem like Chandrila may have strong taboos against same sex relationships that are not shared by the wider galaxy. Vel and Mon are clearly nonconformists by Chandrilan standards, while Perrin and his daughter lean more into traditionalism. So I'm inclined to agree that Chandrilan women probably are expected to marry young, and high class ones are probably expected to enter into political marriages. I wouldn't be surprised if Perrin and Mon's own marriage was very much like this, and if so, it would explain why Mon is against them now. So let's get into the Aldani mission itself. While the Empire is preoccupied with a local starfall ritual, there's only a token force left in the facility. Moreover, the rebels have a man on the inside, a disgruntled Imperial officer. Vel and Cinta sneak in through one direction and take over the facility. Meanwhile, Cassian and his group pose as Imperial soldiers and seize the payroll along with their ride out. This is really the part of the Andor show that really feels the most like Rogue One to me in practice. It has that World War II war movie flavor, with Cassian and his squad sneaking in and trying not to attract attention. I also feel like even though the setup is slow burn, the story gets good when you get to the main event. Also, like Rogue One, when things start going wrong, they go badly wrong, leaving Cassian to pick up the pieces of the mission. So even though they succeed, it comes out as a heavy cost in terms of lives. Also, the way they execute this mission still manages to surprise you at times. I saw Nemec's death coming a mile off, but the way it happens is unexpected, and it threw me for a loop on my first viewing. Did you have any thoughts on the Aldani mission and the way it played out, Mike?
I actually got a little bit of a golden eye vibe with Veldon Center running across the top of the dam and then jumping off the face of it. So there was a bit of a spy feel to it for me as well. I'm I'm gonna have to take your word on the World War II movie feel, though. I've really only seen Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers, and Pacific. I did actually talk to like I want to say it was 3 or 4 guys that were actually on the beach in Normandy. But I'm not sure about all the stuff happening in World War II there. So I'm not sure I'm the best person to respond to that, but I think I can imagine what you're talking about there. I'm sure there was a fair amount of breaking into enemy facilities in World War II, and I know for a fact there were attempts to try and cripple the Nazis' infrastructure and supply lines during the war. So a heist like this seems very possible. The team itself was a bumbling mess, though, and I'm going to blame that on the lack of communication beforehand. All I can say is that Lady Luck and the Luck Sprites of Endor must have been on their side that night. As for Nemec, while I was not surprised that he died, I can't say I saw it coming, but I can say that he was my favorite in the group, to answer your question, aside from Cassian, obviously. I was sad that he met the fate of idealists without the concept of what it will cost to hold those ideals. If I'm honest, I was hoping he'd be tested and that he would find that fighter in him, but alas, that was not meant to be.
Yeah, that's sad. I can see your point on Goldeneye, though, and there are definitely some clear Bond-like moments in this episode. I definitely agree that the Force was with the group in terms of getting the mission done and getting out mostly in one piece. This plan really should not have worked, and it's pretty impressive that they make it work anyway, even with the casualties they take on the way out.
I really like how the whole heist itself was written. I like that the plan kept trying to fall apart, and they just kept scrambling to try and keep it together. Outside of Ocean's 11 or some other highly trained group, well, the bumbling mess of Aldari feels like a very realistic portrayal to me. No plan survives contact with the enemy, but I believe you
Mhm.
had some stuff to add about ISB, didn't you?
I love the Clausewitz reference. Anyway, as it happens, I do. The story takes a larger perspective as we see what's going on inside the Imperial Security Bureau. It's interesting to see how the bureaucracy works on Coruscant, with different factions of the ISB scheming against the others to get ahead. At the same time, it's clear that Imperial leadership encourages this, with the idea that the best people will pull out ahead in the end.
I am more of a work together towards a common mutually beneficial goal team for accomplishing things kind of guy, but there is something to be said about healthy competitiveness. I'm not going to go off on my rant about participation trophies, but I think humans need aspirations that require them to grow and improve, or we become like stagnant water. I'm not suggesting the dog eat dog style that Major Partagas seems to promote, but competing for pay and promotions motivates employees to do their best work. And ultimately, when you're talking about a structure like that, having all the pieces competing to be the strongest and most efficient, then you're almost guaranteed the highest quality product. In this case, verified information.
True, and honestly, I think it fits the philosophy and methodology of the Sith, which Palpatine would encourage. Anyway, the background arc with the ISB deals with Dedra Miro, who is a rising player within the ISB. The impression I get of her is that she's a true believer in the order offered by the Empire. Dedra doesn't seem to be corrupt at all, and she's competent at her job. As it turns out, she's not quite good enough to match wits with people like Luthen Rail, but she does see the threads of his schemes that most people in the ISB are overlooking. So even though she's working for the Empire, I ended up respecting her character, even though she's basically an antagonist. How well do you think the show handled the ISB, and what did you think of Dedra Miro?
I think I can agree with your assessment there. I think that like, she sees the galaxy in chaos and that the Empire is the order that will cure it. She also thinks outside the box and clearly has a mind that seeks out patterns and things. At least that was my impression. But again, I could just be projecting here. I do that a lot. My brain tends to string things together without actually putting any real thought into it. Like something will happen and I suddenly connect a bunch of dots to several other events. Like my mind has been keeping track of it all without me being consciously aware of it. I guess I see that in her. I also appreciate that she was considering how she would go about a rebellion if it was her by seemingly unbiased lenses. She may not trust anyone, and she definitely holds everyone at a distance. But it seems like her logic is always clear, even if I don't always agree. But she's definitely thorough and takes pride in her work. I will give her that. While she's on the wrong side, there is not much to hate about her.
I can agree with all that. I mean, she is a likable antagonist. We also get one other important player in the series that makes her debut around this point, and that's Mon Mothma. We mainly see her at first because she's doing business with Luthen Rail. That pretty clearly suggests that Mon Mothma is already involved in the formation of the early Rebel Alliance, though she's not yet the woman who would eventually lead the alliance. Around this time, she's a minor senator from Chandrila who's been leveraging her finances to help the rebellion. But even at this point, she's being carefully watched by the Empire, who are undoubtedly looking for something they can use against her. She's a big piece of the puzzle with this series, as it's clear that they're exploring how the rebellion starts to grow before the Civil War fully breaks out. Mike, did you have any thought about Mon Mothma and how she's portrayed in Andor?
Mon Mothma seems to be one of the truly good people on the side of the rebellion. Her pleas are for those suffering at the hands of the Empire and for basic rights for people who would otherwise have no voice in the Empire. She has sacrificed a lot for the cause and stands out as a light among early rebels. One of the things that really sucks about Mon Mothma's position, though, is that she is being used without care by Luthen, who only cares about winning. At his request, she has put herself in quite a predicament, and Luthen's only concern is that he gets the money the Rebel Alliance needs to get started. To make matters worse, Mon Mothma's own husband, Perrin Firtha, seems to be against her political agendas and even seems to be encouraging their daughter to fight with her own mother. You'll notice that you'll notice he nods over and over again in approval when Mon Mothma's daughter acts like a spoiled little brat and challenges her at every corner. Not only does he not support his wife, he is actively working against her out of what seems to be just boredom.
Agreed. And I think this is part of the reason why I think their marriage is political. Anyway, I ended up respecting Mon Mothma a bit more, realizing what her home situation is like and what she's up against. I mean, her husband seems to lean more to the Imperial faction, undermining Mon every chance he gets. He very probably is the reason her daughter is so hostile to Mon as well, and he appears to be a very bad influence on this kid. On top of that, Mon Mothma always has to be extremely careful about everything she does because she's under constant surveillance by the Imperial government. I feel bad for her, honestly.
I do too, and I only feel worse for her as the show goes on. She bears an increasingly heavy weight on her shoulders that does not relent. But we'll talk more about her later. So, what do you say we get into the ending of this particular arc, Steve?
Sounds good to me. So, after the mission is completed, Skeen proposes the idea to Cassian of killing everyone and running off with the payroll. Cassian's response is to shoot Skeen right there, which I have to admit is pretty badass. He then goes to Vel, Cassian does, explains himself, and then just leaves with his share of the loot. It's clear that Cassian still isn't really on board with the rebellion yet, although he is affected by Nemec's death on some level. But I guess the question to address is whether Cassian did the right thing here and how far along he is on the path to joining the rebellion.
Cassian was a thief who did not like the Empire, but he was no rebel. Cassian was in it for the money from the beginning, but Luthen Rail really made him reconsider his position. Cassian was already in opposition to the Empire and was carving away at it piece by piece without really taking a stand. He was more than likely going to die anyway fighting the Empire. Why not make it mean something real? The carrot of the money was what brought him over, but he started to think about things there. I like how the series explores the various reasons why people would join the rebellion, and most of them are not political, but personal reasons and instances where they specifically were wronged by the Empire. Like Bill said, everyone has their own rebellion. I felt like this realization was also a part of his journey to becoming a rebel. When he killed Arvel Skeen for suggesting that they split the money and run, Cassian realized what he was and drew a line in the sand with himself. That is most certainly not who I am. And I think it was in that moment when Cassian was willing to kill for the rebellion that his heart turned. It was a new leaf turned over, and there would be a learning curve. But Cassian does not kill indiscriminately. I believe he only does it when he feels there is not another option, or for a cause greater than himself. So that's why I think the line was drawn right there.
Yeah, I think this is definitely a major turning point for Cassian. He's still not completely on board with supporting the rebellion, as we see later, but he's definitely not a complete mercenary. I mean, he has a sense of honor, and he's not going to cut out on people who have treated him fairly up to that point. And they have common enemies. I mean, all of them hate the Empire, even if it's for different reasons. On some level, Cassian probably does respect what the rebels fight for, even if he can't quite make it real for himself just yet. But killing Skeen brings him another step closer to making that commitment. But I think you had another point you wanted to add.
I do, Steve. So Cassian tells Luthen that the Empire is so full of themselves they didn't even notice the little guy and assume they are just too powerful to have anyone try anything, and that is why Cassian gets away with what he does. So on one hand, the Empire doesn't even consider them a threat, but on the other hand, the Empire is everywhere and knows everything, and they can't even trust the people on their side because they might be a spy for the Empire. It's as if we are to believe that both extremes are happening simultaneously, and that seems to imply that the Empire is selective in what they deem worthy of their time and what is not. A small fry like Cassian could not have gone under the radar, but as soon as he joins the team, he sees that he has stepped on up to a whole new level, as exemplified in the paranoia of the group. Although Luthen was able to operate under the radar too, and he was no small fry.
That makes sense to me. Early on, they're basically where Jyn Erso starts at the beginning of Rogue One. They think that if they don't look up, the Empire won't notice them. But Cassian becomes larger and larger problem for the Empire until he discovers there's no laying low from them. So let's talk about how he makes that discovery. The third arc is where the show takes another turn, and we start seeing Andor come into full view as a series. I also think this is where Cassian turns a corner as a character because his experiences here shape who he becomes afterwards. On the Rogue One episode, I mentioned that it's probably his time in the Imperial labor camp on Steerguard that causes him to disobey his orders later to kill Galen Erso. But I think it's also a huge catalyst that fuels Cassian's decision to join the rebellion as well. But we'll get into that soon enough. Mike, did you have any opening thoughts you wanted to share about this story?
Sure, Steve. I said I was going to cover this in the Rogue One episode, so here it is. This is why I think Cassian didn't assassinate Galen Erso as he was ordered to. You mentioned in the Rogue One episode that perhaps Cassian related to Galen, with them both having been forced to work for the Empire, with Cassian's time in prison, and there is certainly room for that to be true, but I tend to want to add another layer to that. Cassian learned just how disposable people are to the Empire during his arrest and his incarceration in the labor camp, particularly when the old man died and the prison cooked an entire floor to cover up the secret that they should have shared to begin with. I think Cassian saw Krennic give the order to kill off all of the men and even hit Galen, and maybe just maybe, he believed that Cassian is more likely not the enemy that the Rebel Alliance thought that he was. Last but not least, I think Cassian had learned that everyone has their own rebellion, and maybe Galen Erso had his too.
That's definitely possible. I think Cassian's incarceration was a key part of the reason why he disobeyed his orders in Rogue One. He may have realized that killing Galen would have just have been eliminating a symptom and not the disease, which is the Empire and its leadership. So, as you say, he may have seen Krennic as the real enemy and realized that Galen was on their side. I also think that Cassian was trying not to be Luthen in that moment because I'm pretty sure that Luthen would have pulled that trigger.
That is an interesting theory I had actually not considered before. I guess we won't know for certain until season 2, but I could totally see Cassian taking an issue with how Lucen does things after spending some time under his wing. I like that, actually. As for the turn in direction, I think it is all about Cassian both reaping the fruit of his deeds and seeing the effect that his works have had on others. You could see the look of horror in Cassian's face when Mara revealed that it was the heist on Aldhani that he was part of that inspired her to join the rebellion. Well, he took an action on the part of the rebellion by taking part in the heist and even killing Skeen for planning to take the money. He had not joined the rebels yet. In fact, it was his dream to take Marva and Bee and try and find someplace far enough away that the Empire won't find them and live in peace. Even if she had gone with him, he would have found out that no such place exists when the flag of the Empire reigns across the galaxy. But the point is that he probably felt as if he had inadvertently led Marva to her death by inspiring her to join the rebellion.
He very probably did. But he probably didn't consider that Marva was likely going to side with the rebellion anyway, whether it was instigated by him or someone else that gave her the inspiration. I think that Marva is someone who was involved in her share in shady business in her life, and now she's nearing the end of her life. I think Marva decided that she wanted to die standing for something bigger than herself, and for her that was always Ferrix. Aldhani might have sparked the decision to do it, but I think something else would have anyway, even if it wasn't Cassian. So let's get the negatives of the story out of the way first. There are not very many of them with this arc. To be honest, my only real criticism of this third arc revolves around how Cassian gets caught to begin with. When he meets Luthen, Cassian makes a point of telling him that he has a trick for slipping in where he needs to go. He just looks like he belongs, and nobody notices him. But around episode 7, we see Cassian do a lot of dumb things. He goes back to Ferrix, where the Empire is probably looking for him, and somehow, through sheer luck, manages not to get caught while he's there. And then he takes a share of the loot and manages to get caught by doing what Cassian knows not to do. He attracts the attention of the Empire by looking shifty and out of place, and then he gets railroaded and sent to the labor camp. I mean, I know this is just set up to get him where the story needs to go. I understand that, but I just face palm watching Cassian throw his entire playbook out the window. But how about you, Mike? Am I misreading the situation, or do you feel like they could have executed this better?
I'm a bit conflicted about it. On the one hand, it felt like it was just dropping it into the story with what almost amounts to a hand wave as far as writing goes. Like, oh, by the way, he's on this planet. Oh, yeah. And he totally gets arrested on false charges by an asshole cop. On the other hand, I have literally dealt with cops just like that. I was guilty the moment they laid their eyes on me, and it didn't matter what I said or did. They were going to take me in. Like that cop that arrested Cassian. Cassian had been walking. He was not sweating. The cop insisted he was part of it. Cassian didn't even know what it was. The officer that arrested him decided he was guilty without any evidence and attached him to an event that had nothing to do with him. To be fair, if the officer had known who he really was, Cassian getting arrested and a 6-year sentence would have been light. But the fact is that he didn't know who he was. As far as the officer and the judge were concerned, whether he actually did anything was irrelevant. As we would find out, it was the public order resentencing decree and about free slave labor for the empire, so it just didn't matter whether they were criminals or not. According to Colonel Wolf Yularen, the head of the ISB, Palpatine gave ISB unchecked authority to arrest anyone under the suspicion or perceived threat to the empire. Hence, every crime in the Empire is deemed an extreme penalty and therefore comes with severe sentences. The judge that sentenced Cassian laughed as this new law turned a 6-month sentence into 6 years.
I can definitely sympathize to the extent that we needed to see Cassian be on the receiving end of the system. He needs to feel the steel boot of the Empire on his back to finally prod him to join the rebellion. And I think it's appropriate that Cassian do so by feeling the consequences of what he did on Aldhani, at least indirectly, as an inciting incident. I just wish it had been executed a little bit better than it was, but I can conceptually see what the writers were trying to do. But now let's get into what those consequences were and how it ties into Cassian's imprisonment in the work camp. So in our Rogue One discussion, I talked about how Emperor Palpatine loves to take advantage of acts of rebellion to gain power. This turns out to be a major part of his MO. For instance, he capitalizes on the Jedi's attempt to arrest him and uses it as a justification for Order 66. In our Rogue One discussion, we mentioned that the Battle of Scarif was used to justify dissolving the Senate permanently. He does the same thing after Aldhani, using the payroll heist to pass new draconian public security laws that control the population. That's nothing new in and of itself. What I think Andor does well is showing the ground level view of the consequences of this, as well as the larger political game being played on both sides. What gets Cassian in trouble isn't his shifty behavior, per se. It's the unintended consequences of the Aldhani raid, as the Empire uses the new public security laws to send him to a labor camp. So the political game being played by the Empire ends up having a direct impact on Cassian's life and on regular people living through the Empire. That gives this world more of a grounded sense of reality than you typically see in a lot of Star Wars stories.
The consequences across the board are a big part of what this show is about. Luthen knew that the Aldhani heist would push the Emperor to overact, but he didn't see how far-reaching those consequences would go. On the flip side of that, the Emperor clenched his fist even tighter and even more star systems slipped through his fingers, to paraphrase Leia. I like the overall ground floor approach to the series in general. The franchise as a whole seems to be on a much grander scale, and I like seeing the more mid and lower level stuff that adds up to those big moments. I think the real strength of the show lies in its ability to show both the burgeoning empire as well as the rebellion. There seems to be a lot of gray areas on both sides of the battle, and I like the more nuanced way of telling the story. I mean, clearly the empire is evil, but that doesn't make everyone in the empire evil. I mean, even Rome, with all of its atrocities, had good aspects of it and made some really monumental achievements in the advancement of civilization. So too, I imagine, can the Empire look like it's bringing order to the chaos. On the flip side of that, not everyone in the Alliance is good. There's a whole lot of gray in there and some straight up dark stuff as well. But everyone has their own rebellion.
Exactly. Heroes on both sides, to quote Attack of the Clones. So let's talk about some of those. For a long time, some people have argued that the people working on the Death Star didn't deserve to be blown up. But Andor throws that preconception in a new light as we see what's really going on under the surface. The show implies that the Death Star was built through prison labor, which in this case is basically slavery. Many of these prisoners had artificially extended sentences and thrown into harsh conditions that didn't fit the crimes they were convicted for. What we see in these episodes is a prison industrial complex that uses the prisoners as unpaid labor, all to build a massive death machine. And after all that, the prisoners are summarily killed so that the secret never gets out. These people are used and discarded, strung along in the hope of release, only to find out that there is no release. Even by the admittedly low standards of Palpatine and Tarkin, that is morally repugnant. I come away feeling horrible for these prisoners who are caught up in the Empire's web and are forced to either work in these camps or face a swift execution. But how about you, Mike?
I do feel very bad for the prisoners. I actually felt bad for them from the very beginning after witnessing how little, if anything, had to be done to get sentenced there. But while I came away with a different theory, what you presented there is pretty solid. I really like the idea of the Empire killing off those who worked on the Death Star. I can totally see that fitting. Also, with how close they were to having the Death Star completed, by that point, I can even see the timing of it. But let me bounce this additional layer off of you and see if we can't meet in the middle somehow. When Cassian first gets to the prison, a guard is late because they had to pull a guy up from 4. That doesn't seem like anything your first time through, but in a rewatch, I found that to be foreshadowing of prisoners suffering the effects of the public order resentencing decree. The guy finished his sentence on 4, and his new sentence started on a different level. And being that it was up from 4, it was probably a better level. When Cassian arrives in the cell block, everyone is asking him about the PORD, but he doesn't know anything about it. However, I think he does know the effects that the Aldani heist have been having across the galaxy, and I wonder if he suspected that the Aldani heist caused the PORD. Later, Cassian figures out that every time a guy goes out, another guy always comes in the next day, again foreshadowing the cyclical nature of their sentences after the resentencing. It seems like the number crawling on their cells is their original sentence, but then their PORD sentence kicks in and they start serving their new sentences. So instead of going free, they go back to work talking about not getting released like they should. A riot starts and they fry the whole level. Both shifts if 100 men were fried. So what do you say about both of those things being a factor in what went down there, Steve?
Certainly possible. It could be that they're also recycling people to new levels. I mean, it could be a reason why the Empire is cutting off all communication between prisoner groups. Either way, being dropped in this prison is basically a life sentence where you're forced to work until you die on the job or you're summarily executed. They don't want anybody to talk about what they're building, and we know that Tarkin was keeping the Death Star under complete secrecy in Rogue One. As for frying the whole level, that may be another reason for their life sentences and the railroading people by the dozens to replace them. It's brutally efficient, much as the Empire tends to be, but it's awful for anyone living under them. So let's talk about one example. Kino Loy is one of the more interesting characters in this arc. He's one of those prisoners who's getting close to the end of his sentence, just marking time until his release. He doesn't want anything to do anything to screw this up, and he ends up making sure people don't get out of line before he's out. Of course, he doesn't know at this point that the Empire doesn't plan on letting anybody out with what they know. I don't know about you, Mike, but I kind of felt like Kino's arc was telegraphed pretty much from the start. Because once Kino finds out that there's no getting out, he has no choice but to help Cassian stage a breakout. This again goes back to what we've talked about in Rogue One. I mean, how the Empire creates the rebellions that they're trying to destroy. But what's your take on Kino and his development in these episodes?
I'm starting to see a pattern here where I was just not as critical of the writing and series as you were. Some things did seem obvious when you brought them up, but they certainly didn't bother me. As a writer, I know some of the tricks writers use and why, but that doesn't make me not like that they used it or think less of them for it. I'm really more concerned with if they did it well, and I think Andor as a whole does. But when we're talking about Kino, I think having Andy Serkis play the role helped out a whole lot with the character. If there was one thing that really stood out for me about the character was when Cassian told him, "I'd rather die trying to take them down than die giving them what they want." You could tell that a light came on in Kino, like he could finally see. I think that up until that moment, Kino had just never thought about it like that. I think he realized that one way or another he was going to die in that moment, and it lit a fire in him. I was bummed out by the fact that he could not swim and ended up being yet another person who helped save the day, but got nothing from it.
Yeah, I can totally understand that. I guess I should clarify and say that I'm not pointing out the telegraphing with an intent to be critical. I don't really have any issues with anything that goes on in the prison scenes. In fact, it's more of a Chekhov's gun element where you can see it coming and you want Kino to finally realize what's in store for him in time to help Cassian. There's some good tension to be found in there. But I do agree that Andy Serkis is great in this role, and he projects both authority and fear at exactly the right moments. It really is sad that he ultimately doesn't make it out, but he's able to give everyone else time to make their escapes, including Cassian and Melshi.
Ah, okay. I guess I was just taking that wrong. I can see what you're
Mhm.
saying now. Thanks for clearing that up. But I believe you wanted to talk about Deidre Miro, didn't you, Steve?
I sure do. Around the same time, we see that Dedra Miro is trying to track down Cassian, not knowing that the Empire's already taken him. Throughout these episodes, she comes across as extremely efficient, hunting for a direct link between Aldani and a rebel known as Axis. Axis is, of course, Luthen Rail. But Luthen has been very good at covering his tracks. She has no idea who he is or where to even look for him, so she needs Cassian in order to identify who Axis is. The thing with Dedra Miro in this arc is that she pivots to a villainous role, but I still found her likable. What I like about her here is that she's not needlessly cruel, even though her interrogations get pretty brutal. She doesn't enjoy hurting people. She's not a sadist like some people working for the Empire, but in her eyes, she'll do whatever it takes to do her job. I mean, her main interest is in identifying and capturing Axis, and she sees her interrogations as an unfortunate necessity if it means keeping order. What I appreciate about her character is that Andor likes to show the complex situations on both sides of the conflict. You get darker characters like Luthen and Saw Gerrera on one side of the rebellion, but you also get essentially honest Imperials like Dedra who are reluctant to get their hands too dirty until they feel that they have to. All this presents a complex portrait of the whole conflict and what Civil War is like when you don't have lightsabers and force powers. Mike, did you have any thoughts on Miro's investigation and the interrogation scenes in this arc?
I find it interesting that there are multiple warnings throughout the first season that remind people that there are costs to war and that this is what revolution looks like. Even Luthen admitted to having no concept of how much his path would ask of him. Sometimes I think he's, and perhaps even Vel, reminding himself just as much as others. As far as Mira goes, I guess that I liked her approach to the torture. Every opportunity is given for them to speak, and there is a limit. She knows someone can only be broken so far, and they are no longer useful at that point. I say this because that guy was only tortured through the night, and she knew that it was a waste of time from that point on, and so she brought in Bix. But she lets Bix see him before they take him out. A lot of people probably assume that torture is about pain and how long one can endure it. But while that's part of it, that is the trunk of the tree and not the root. The real trick to torture for the purpose of extracting information is psychological. The doctor taking his time to describe what he was going to do to Bix was a big part of the device's effectiveness. A good torturer's greatest tool is the imagination of his victim, and I think that even the device they used shows that that was understood. All of that to say there was a point to all that was done there. Sadism never entered into it.
That's what I really appreciated, at least in Dedra's case. She knows that they're no longer useful if they're too broken to speak. So there's this prelude to the torture where she shows the consequences of resistance and then offers a way out of the pain and they cooperate. To quote the 12th Doctor, the victim is the most essential thing in the torture chamber because the information is what gives them their value. Meanwhile, we see Captain Toole return to the spotlight as the show attempts to make Cyril Karn a thing again. The last few episodes did follow him briefly as he's understandably fired from Morlana security. After that, he ends up going back to Coruscant with his mother to try to rebuild his life. He does get an opportunity to do that, mainly through the influence of Cyril's mother and an uncle who is highly placed in the Empire. I felt like the show is trying to make us sympathize with Cyril in these episodes, but for me, it just kind of fell flat. The problem is that his situation is one of Cyril's own making, and nothing he really does in these episodes shows that he's learned a single solitary thing from the Ferrex disaster. If anything, he seems to be doubling down on it, blaming Cassian for his own bad decisions and getting more obsessive. Also, Cyril seems to be getting back to his old bad habits, which is his tendency to take matters into his own hands instead of minding his own business. Some of it is his continuing to dig into Cassian even after being warned off by Miro. He's putting his new job in the Imperial government at risk just by doing this, but he keeps digging. And then his behavior starts getting into stalkerish territory as he deliberately sets up an encounter on the street with Dedra Miro. And even after being warned off by her twice, he still doesn't take a hint. The one thing I liked in the scenes, though, the fact that Dedra Miro won't give Cyril the time of day in their scenes together. The thing is, she's actually competent and good at her job, and she investigated Cyril thoroughly before she even brought him in. So she knows that this guy is a failure who's bad at following the chain of command. I like that the show leads you to think that Cyril might get a job with the ISB, and then Dedra turns around and slaps him with a dose of reality. So as much as I hate this character and didn't want him to come back, I do like that Miro doesn't want anything to do with Cyril, and she just rebuffs him every time he gets into her face.
Yeah.
Mike, did you have anything you wanted to add about Cyril and how he's handled in this story?
I actually did feel bad for Cyril. His mom is emasculating, demeaning, and cruel with her vicious tongue. She is always on attack, shame, and guilt trips while deflecting anything pointed back at all of her bullshit. She puts him down about everything and constantly tells him what a worthless piece of shit he is. I think those encounters say a lot about his disposition. I mean, imagine growing up with that and trying to be a man of any sort. That said, I'm not a huge fan of the serial character either, but I will say he reminds me a bit of Norman Bates with how his mother treats him. Not that I think he's going to dress up in his mother's clothes and kill people, but in how he carries himself in that sort of feeble way. Even standing at attention, it looks ingenuine. He acts like a broken man, I guess is my point. As far as his relationship with Miro, I think that both have the desire for order, and that having any kind of understanding or common ground with the woman figure most likely meant a lot to him, considering his relationship with his mother. At the same time, he totally goes into stalker mode, like you said, and clearly has a little to no experience being in that kind of situation. But you'll note that Cyril was equally enthusiastic towards Sergeant Linus Mosk when he showed an understanding of where Cyril was coming from. Cyril is a man in desperate need of common ground with others and approval from others because of how his mother treated him. That said, I do respect Miro's treatment of him. She could have really brought the hammer down on him, and she didn't. She also didn't automatically dismiss him like others do. But like I said earlier, I have to wonder how the guy with all these issues acquired his rank to begin with. He seems to lack the skills and mindset required for it.
Yeah, I can agree with that last bit for sure. Maybe it's because he's one of the few honest cops on Orlana. I don't know, but I do agree that his mother is the really an insufferable character, and you begin to understand why Cyril is such a mess when you see where he comes from. So let's get into the inevitable prison break. I'll say this: Cassian regains the brain cells that he lost at the beginning of the arc. Throughout these episodes, that he's in the Imperial prison, Cassian has been taking notes and looking for weaknesses in the system that he can exploit. He finds out that the floors aren't electrified when the elevator in the workroom is halfway down. He's able to stash tools from the workroom away to open the water main in the back room. He finds out that the best opportunity to escape is when they replace a dead prisoner with a new worker. And when Kino is convinced to help, Cassian finds out how many guards are in the complex. The trick with doing prison break stories is that both sides have to look reasonably clever while allowing the jailbreak to work. The Empire turns out to have a pretty decent setup, and the electrified floors offer a cool new problem for Cassian to work around. The Empire also does a good job at restricting the flow of information and encouraging competition to keep the prisoners from cooperating with each other. A very Sith thing, I may add. At the same time, Cassian and Kino come up with good ways of getting past those problems, realizing that strength in numbers is something that the guards are not equipped to deal with. At the same time, the way out never feels too easy, and a lot of prisoners end up dying while Cassian makes his escape. But what did you think about it, Mike?
Well, first, I had to comment on you made the comment about the astuteness of Cassian, and that is definitely true. I mean, like back when they were doing the heist, how he did the whole thing of he knew exactly which hand each person used in the group, just because he pays that much attention to everything. I was just really impressed with that. So that all that happening in the jail there felt really in character. Um, but you seem to hit all the major points already. But I will say that I thought the prison break worked well enough for the story. Although I think jumping into the water from that height was a bit ridiculous. That could have easily killed or injured the jumpers. I did like that they shorted out the floor in 5, and that allowed them to get past the first big hurdle. But honestly, Kino's speech was the best part of it. You know, Bell says, "One path, one choice, we win or everyone dies. It starts now." And later, Kino Loy says, "There is one way out, right now." And then repeats what Cassian said: "I would rather die trying to take them down than than giving them what they want. While the lines are not exactly alike, I think the same spirit resides in both of them.
I agree with that. That seems to be a recurring theme in this series, so we may well see it again. But before we move on to the last two episodes, let's talk about what the rebels have been up to while all this is going on. We can start with Luthen, since he's kept a lower profile in the middle episodes. Initially, Luthen's assistant Clea decides to have Cassian killed because he's the one person who can link Luthen to Rail to Axis. So she sends out Vel, who ends up having a more complicated and interesting background than I originally thought. But we'll get into that in a little bit. For now, I'll just say that Vel ends up investigating a lot of wrong leads in the hopes of getting to Cassian. In the meantime, Luthen decides to set his own plans for the rebellion into motion. He places a full radio silence of Ferrix, which is now a dangerous place for him to be associated with. This is what ends up getting Cassian's friend Bix in trouble and caught by the Empire. For most of the season, Luthen sends proxies like Cinda to keep an eye on the Empire's business on Ferrix, while he turns his attention to the wider rebellion elsewhere. In one particularly good scene, though, we see Luthen heading out to meet with Saw Gerrera on a planet called Segra Milo. Luthen is trying to hire Saw and his group to go out and support Anto Krieger's raid on an Imperial power station called Spellhouse. Saw initially refuses, mainly because of conflicts that Saw has with Krieger. Saw at first objects on the basis that Krieger is slow and stupid, but we eventually see his real reason for refusing Luthen's deal. In part one, I pointed out that Saw Gerrera hates separatists because they killed his sister during the Clone Wars. Anto Krieger is a separatist, and it's clear that Saw's old hatred of the separatists are holding him back from forming alliances with people who hate the Empire as much as he does. Luthen seems to recognize this, but he's more interested in uniting all the different anti-Imperial factions that eventually become the Rebel Alliance. It eventually turns out that Saw's refusal works out to his benefit in the end, but for the wrong reasons. But before we get into why that is, Mike, did you have any thoughts on Luthen and Saw in this story?
Luthen clearly sees anyone who opposes the Empire as the same, and I imagine that is because he has turned himself into an amalgamation of various beliefs to work with so many opposing points of view. This seems to suggest that for Luthen, opposition is all that he knows, and it has ceased to be a moral or political issue. He is damned for what he does, and he has burned away his own decency by using the tools of his enemies. He is a walking contradiction. At the same time, I have learned that even the idealistic Starfleet needs a Section 31, because they are flat-out truths about war that are dark and horrible, and there is no escaping that. As for Saw, I looked at him differently until I heard that he was an anarchist. At least that is what Luthen said to his face, and Saw didn't deny it at all. I can't respect someone fighting for anarchy. That is clearly half mad anyway. Honestly, I kind of wrote him off right there.
We definitely started to see how Saw starts to lose it by the time of Rogue One. We talked about last time that by the time of Rogue One, he's gotten so paranoid that he's using dangerous creatures to read people's minds, including people that a reasonable person should trust. Luthen seems to recognize that while Saw isn't that unhinged yet, the potential is definitely there for him to get to that point. So from here, let's talk about where Vel gets really interesting, and that is her connection to Mon Mothma. It turns out that Vel's full name is in fact Vel Sartha, and she's the cousin of Mon Mothma. So we see Vel visit Mon Mothma on a couple of occasions, ostensibly as family visits, but really they're secret meetings as they plot rebellion against the Empire. One thing I find really interesting about Vel and Mon Mothma is the masks that they wear to evade detection by the Empire. Mon Mothma acts like a senator whose main interest is charity work, and all the while she uses her charitable operations to fund rebel activity. I mean, war costs money after all, and Mon's involvement with Luthen is largely about raising money to finance the rebellion. But Mon is dealing with potential exposure because the Empire is closely watching what she's doing, and she can't touch her family finances without alerting the Empire to her subversive activities. This forces her into making dangerous sacrifices, including arranging a match between her daughter and the son of a criminal financier. In the case of Vel, she takes on the persona of a traveling socialite and party girl to mask her activities. This is presumably meant to explain why Vel is constantly traveling all the time. It's a cover to throw the Empire off of her involvement with the rebels, and specifically with Luthen. Like her cousin, Vel has a great deal to lose if she's caught, and she has to wear false identities constantly so that her rebel missions don't lead to exposure. In addition to that, she also has a relationship with Cinta, leading Vel to hide it from everyone on Coruscant or otherwise risk discovery by the Empire. I ended up liking Vel a lot more than I did in the second arc once I learned more about her. I feel like her background adds more to her character, but what was your reaction, Mike?
I did like Vel a lot more later on too, with the exception of her visit to Luthen's antiquities dealership. She is
Yeah.
basically pulling a Bruce Wayne as a cover, and I like that. As I mentioned before, I think she's a bit over her head with everything, but I really like the idea of Vel and Mon Mothma working together. As cousins, I imagine they really only have themselves to confide in, and I think both of them really need that. You could tell when Mon was basically pouring her heart out to Vel that she really needed that. I also kind of feel bad for Vel. Vel seems like a reasonable girl for the most part, and yet she got into a relationship with Cinta that could have jeopardized the mission on Aldari, as well as blow her cover, as like you mentioned, Steve. It would seem that even in her attempted private life, she is in over her head, and that is where she likes to sit.
She does. I love the Bruce Wayne analogy. I think that really is descriptive. I also really love Vel and Mon's relationship. They're cousins, but they act like sisters, and that works given their shared situation. But before we moved on, I have to mention my favorite scene in the entire series. We're following Lonnie, who is a member of the ISB, as he goes down an elevator somewhere on Coruscant. Now, before we get into the scene, I have to mention this. Up until this point, the Empire seems to be gaining the upper hand, and they're acting like they're a step ahead and that they're winning. The Empire has set a trap for Anto Krieger, and it looks like the whole operation is about to go south. But I had a feeling all along watching it that Luthen still had a hand to play, and by the time he played it, we were likely going to find out that everyone's been dancing to his tune the entire time. That turns out to be exactly what happens, because Lonnie is a double agent working for Luthen. It turns out that Lonnie was placed in the ISB for the last 6 years as a plant, and he's been feeding Luthen information about everything going on within the ISB. In turn, Luthen has been sacrificing resources to protect Lonnie because he's a valuable operative that he doesn't want to lose. Lonnie is so important, in fact, that Luthen decides to sacrifice Anto Krieger to the Empire to keep Lonnie safe from suspicion. But Lonnie now has a wife and a family, and Lonnie's having doubts about what he's continuing to risk and sacrifice for the rebellion. He asks to know what it is that Luthen has sacrificed for the cause. It's at this point that Stellan Skarsgård delivers probably his best performance ever as Luthen Rael to date. I don't want to summarize his speech here because there's just no way I can do it justice. This whole thing is on YouTube anyway, so I just suggest just taking a minute just to watch it. I'll just say that I love the line, "I made my mind a sunless space." That is just great dialogue. But the important point is that Luthen admits that he sacrificed his soul in his battle against the Empire. He knows what he's doing is morally wrong. He's convinced himself that it's necessary. He lives with regrets for what he's done, and his sins cost him constantly. He also knows that he'll never get the credit for stopping the Empire, even if his side wins. He's condemned to always operate from the shadows. He is never going to stand on a podium and get a medal from Princess Leia, and he knows that. But that's not going to stop him from completing the mission he set for himself after all that he sacrificed. I have to admit that I'm fascinated by characters that walk the darkness as an act of sacrifice. These are people driven by a sense of necessity to do terrible things, but they're not inherently evil people. We talked about Revan as an example of this in the Rogue One episode. But Luthen seems to be another character who sacrificed his soul to save the galaxy, although his allegiances and goals are different. This scene really cements and establishes who Luthen Rael is as a character and what it is he really believes. But how about you, Mike? What is your take on this scene and on Luthen's sacrifices?
Wow. I suppose my first reaction is that I would never do that. To be fair, I'm not political at all. But to sacrifice the things that Luthen has sacrificed is respectable, even if, as I mentioned before, I would choose my own conscience over winning anything. I personally believe, as I think Doctor Who does, that once we are doing what we know to be wrong to win, we've lost already. Turning into our enemies can't ever be the answer for me. Otherwise, I am a house divided against itself. But at the same time, as I mentioned before, just because I'm not the man for the job doesn't mean that I don't know that war is war. But respect is about all I can offer there. I can't admire someone who willingly does what they know to be evil. As far as Lonnie goes, I have to disagree with Luthen. Maybe Lonnie should not have gotten involved with a woman, and maybe they should not have had a child. For those things, Lonnie was wrong given his position. At the same time, this is what happened, and Lonnie's life is no longer his own. His responsibilities have shifted to that child and his wife. Just because Luthen gave up everything doesn't mean Lonnie has to or even can at that point. Like I said, what he did was wrong, but it just doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah, I couldn't do something like that either. I mean, I'm inclined to agree regarding the Doctor, who has made the terrible decisions in his past and is tormented by regrets for it. The closest that he's come to making a decision like that was when he ended the Time War, and he did everything he could to not have to make such a choice. So you have a point there. That said, I find the people who could do that endlessly fascinating for some reason, and I can't really explain why. It just may be the question itself. What does it take for someone to see their moral situation with total clarity and still choose to do wrong? I really hope that we get that answer from for Luthen in season 2, because I feel like there's so much about him we still don't fully understand yet.
Actually, Steve, I totally understand your fascination with characters like that. And actually, I think it shows that we have something in common there, albeit slightly different. We have talked about my fascination with villains and what makes them tick. I think your fascination with characters that cross the lines and why they would choose to do that parallels my fascination with villains. Just one more reason we're such good friends, I think. But
Hmm.
we still have two more episodes to cover. So, how about we move on to episode 11 and 12, Steve?
That's a good idea. So let's get into that. The last 2 episodes of the first season are where the major threads come together. By the time Cassian makes his way out of jail with Melshi, we find out that Cassian's adopted mother, Marva, is dead. Her funeral ends with being the focus of a number of different threads for different reasons. One of them is that Marva was a well-respected member of the community who had loyalties to the rebellion, and the locals on Ferrix liked her. But a number of factions are interested because they think Cassian is going to come back to Ferrix. The Empire is using the funeral as a trap to ensnare Cassian because Dedra Miro wants to capture him and expose Axis. Luthen's people want to silence Cassian before he can reveal what he knows to the Empire. And Captain Tool has this weird fixation on Cassian and has received a lead about Marva's death and her funeral from Mosk. So basically, everyone is after Cassian, and they think that this is the best chance to capture or kill him. Of course, if I'm Cassian, I don't know why I'd go back to Ferrix at all. Before she died, Marva warned him to stay away and never come back to Ferrix. Nobody would think less of Cassian for not going back in that situation. While I do think Cassian does a brave thing in trying to use the confusion to rescue Bix, there are so many ways that it could have gone wrong. So I guess I should ask here, was going back to Ferrix the right decision? Or would Cassian have been better off finding the Empire in another way and leaving Ferrix well enough alone?
It may not have been the smart or cautious move, but I think it was a move that had to be done. But there were a number of factors making that decision. Throughout the first season of Andor, Cassian did his best to stick to his loner code and keep himself insulated from too many attachments. One of the first attachments to go was his search for his sister. Letting go of that at Marva's request basically left Marva, B, Bix, and Brasso. However, with as much as he wanted to stay out of it, the Empire found him and his family and friends wherever they went. By the time Cassian was considering whether or not to go back to Ferrix, it had been both literally and figuratively beaten into him that the Empire was not a problem, that he was going to go away, and he could no longer just ignore it. The other big motivating factor after this realization for Cassian is that he finally read Nemik's manifesto. Nemik said this in his manifesto: "There will be times when the struggle seems impossible. I know this already. Alone, unsure, dwarfed by the scale of the enemy, remember this. Freedom is a pure idea. It occurs spontaneously and without instruction. Random acts of insurrection are happening across the galaxy. There are whole armies, battalions that have no idea that they've already enlisted in the cause. Remember that the frontier of the rebellion is everywhere, and even the smallest act of insurrection pushes our lines forward. And remember this: the imperial need for control is so desperate because it is so unnatural. Tyranny requires constant effort. It breaks, it leaks. Authority is brittle. Oppression is the mask of fear. Remember that and know this: the day will come when all these skirmishes and battles, those moments of defiance, will have flooded the banks of the Empire's authority, and then there will be one too many. One single thing will break the siege. Remember this. Try." I think after all of that, Cassian felt as if the choice was made for him. I don't imagine that Cassian had any other choice, I guess, is my answer.
Hmm. So, if I understand you right, you're saying that Cassian's time in prison changed him to the point where he can't look away from the Empire anymore. It brought him back to Nemec's manifesto, and he starts to really live the rebellion's ideals rather than to try to keep running. So, he's actively decided to confront the Empire rather than just trying to keep his head down and look out for himself. That means he can't ignore Bix or anyone else on Ferris, no matter how bad the situation looks. I guess I could see that. That does seem to add up as a character arc, so I'm willing to go with that.
See, that is exactly what I'm saying. It was that realization that fully converted him and why he ends up making the choice that he does at the end of the series. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I think you wanted to talk about the Battle of Ferrix, didn't you, Steve?
I do, but let's set up some dominoes first before we set them falling. So as we get into the setup on the Battle of Ferrix, let's talk about the pieces that are set into motion. The most important of these is Luthen Rail, who now knows that the Spellhouse operation is compromised. He meets again with Saw Gerrera, who finally agrees to cooperate with Krieger. However, Luthen warns against this, and then Saw realizes that Luthen is willing to let Krieger die to keep his informant on the board. And honestly, this may be the only time I've ever seen Saw taken aback by someone going to extremes for the rebel cause. If the paranoid extremist or revolutionary is telling you that you're going too far, there's something wrong here. Now, we've seen that Luthen is willing to sacrifice whatever's necessary for the rebellion as much as it damns him to do it. So I guess I should ask, which of the two is farthest off course and why?
Well, I kind of touched on this a bit earlier, but I think that the guy fighting for anarchy is the farthest off course. So I'm going to say Saw Gerrera. Luthen's goal is the end of the Empire. And while he may be juggling multiple truths at the same time to do it, order will be the outcome. Whereas with Saw, we'd be replacing oppressive order with no order at all. Both are extremists, as you say, but you make a very valid point in saying that when Saw Gerrera is saying you might be going too far, that should be a big old red flag. But I stand by what I said. Luthen is the lesser of two evils there.
That makes sense. It is true that Luthen is at least reasonably sane, and he's focused on the real enemy, so that makes sense to me. So let's get into what he does next. As Luthen tries to head back to Coruscant, he gets intercepted by an Imperial patrol. And here we realize how ridiculously Batman level prepared this guy is. Luthen's Hallcraft is decked out like nobody's business. And he can change between transponders on command. The ship is armed and capable of dark dogfighting against a squadron of TIE fighters and win. And he's got his ship decked out so well that he can break the hold of a tractor beam from an Imperial Arrestor cruiser and leap into hyperspace. I got to be honest, I really want a Hallcraft now. but that leads into my next question. At this point, the Imperials know that there's a tricked out Hallcraft that's probably connected with rebel activity. They don't know that this is Luthen or that Luthen is Axis. But the next thing Luthen does after this is head straight to Ferrix to watch Marva's funeral. That seems like a pretty risky move for Luthen to do, considering that Ferrix is a direct link to his activities as Axis. There are a lot of ways for him to get caught by the Empire, especially given that they're on high alert at Ferrix. And up to this point, Luthen's been pretty careful about it not exposing himself. I'm not sure why he takes the risk of going to Ferrix, except that the plot requires him to be there, but I admit that I could well be missing something. Mike, do you have any ideas of what Luthen might have been thinking here? Go ahead.
First, I have to say that I like the idea of Luthen's Hallcraft basically being the Batmobile of the Star Wars universe.
Yeah.
But I think the answer is this. Ferrix was the one place in the galaxy that Luthen knew that Cassian would be at, and he had to be silenced, or they would be risking exposure and the collapse of all that they had accomplished. If Luthen did not go to Ferrix, then who knows when or if he would have seen Cassian again. And by the time he did catch up to him again, there is no telling who he might have talked to or told about him. Cassian is not the greatest secret keeper. He referred to Luthen a couple of times, though not by name, during the heist, and he also told so many people that he was from Kenari that he couldn't even list them all. I'm sure that with Luthen knowing seemingly everything about Cassian, that he probably knew that about him too.
That's a fair guess. So Luthen may have decided that silencing Cassian was worth the risk of going to Ferrix, and he didn't have confidence that Sil and Cinna could do the job. I mean, that is an interesting theory. Well, I mean, he ultimately ends up being right in the sense that Cassian eludes pretty much everyone, so you may have a point there. I'm still not sure this was his best move, but that's the best theory we have right now, so, let's run with it. So let's get into Dedra Meero's operation and her attempt to capture Cassian. It's here that she starts to make some mistakes, which is a bit unusual for her. The plan is to use Marva's funeral as a trap to capture Cassian, but she also leaves Bix relatively unguarded between preparing for the possible uprising in the streets and rigging the trap against Cassian. I'm really surprised that someone like Miro, who usually has her angles covered, wouldn't anticipate that Cassian would use the confusion to try to rescue Bix. Is there anything I'm missing here, Mike, or does this sound like a tactical error?
It was definitely a tactical error. It is clear that despite having all those troopers and soldiers, the populace of the city outnumbered them. They obviously knew that as they tried to limit the number of people that could come, but it didn't work. Instead of the 40 maximum, there were hundreds there. I think you're right that this should have been expected, but my guess is that there might have been some ego there that suggested that they were superior to their foes. I suggest arrogance because Miro would not have put herself in a situation where she could have been ripped apart by an angry mob if hubris was not involved there. But might I also suggest that perhaps a little tunnel vision might have been there on the part of Miro? She was so focused on Andor that she lost sight of Bix. I was also surprised that a bomb was not even considered as a possibility, considering that Luthen and Cassian used one in the city already. But like our D&D party on Fellowship of the D20, they gathered in a group, made a perfect target for that bomb, and they all died. that whole situation erupted into absolute chaos, and it did not have to.
And this is why you don't clump up into a group when there's a mage on the other side of the door. Well played. That said, it does seem likely that overconfidence and tunnel vision played into Dedra making some uncharacteristic mistakes here. But there's one other thing that plays into Cassian's favor here, so let's get into that for a moment. So Marva helps out Cassian for one last time, even if Cassian himself doesn't necessarily realize it. One thing I really liked about the funeral scene is the idea of a pre-recorded hologram as Marva's final statement. It makes sense that that's exactly how it would work in the Star Wars galaxy. But it's not the technology I want to draw attention to, it's the content of what she says. Marva's last statement is an act of defiance against the Empire, and it's so rousing that it inspires a riot in the streets of Ferrix. More accurately, it causes the Empire to try to silence Marva's hologram, which in turn outrages the people of Ferrix and lead them to the riot. By this point, you can tell that Marva has reached that age where she no longer cares about her own life or what happens to her. She knows she's about to die anyway, and she wants to die on her own terms. She cares about the future of Ferrix and about the people who come after her, and she wants them to be free of the Empire. She's probably also thinking of Cassian, though she doesn't mention him in the speech at all. But what was your take on Marva's speech and her thinking behind it?
Well, considering her speech, I'd say that the evil of the Empire is something that has eaten away at Marva for decades. And instead of taking a stand, she allowed her fear to rule her instead. As Marva said, she finally reached an age where the fear was not enough to hold her back anymore. But she truly regretted allowing the fear to defeat her, to stay asleep rather than wake up and act. I think she was ashamed of that. Consider Marva's message to Cassian. Tell him none of this is his fault. It was already burning. He's just the first spark of the fire. He knows everything he needs to know and feels everything he needs to feel. And when the day comes when those two pull together, he will be an unstoppable force for good. Tell him I love him more than anything he could ever do wrong. I think Marva did not want Cassian to feel the regret and shame she felt for not standing up before.
That's very possible, and connecting her speech to her last words to Cassian adds up to the larger picture of Marva and what she's doing here. One thing I noticed, though, is that Marva's speech seemed to have an impact on Luthen, who is in the streets watching the whole thing. He doesn't really say anything about it. I mean, not in terms of dialogue, but Stellan Skarsgård is such a good actor that you could see the wheels turning in his head, just through facial expressions and posture. He turns his head away for a moment, possibly thinking about what he sacrificed. He definitely seems to respect Marva and her final statement, and he likes what it inspires. It may be that Luthen realizes at this point that one powerful statement, spoken bravely and with conviction, can have as much impact for the rebellion as any of his acts of sacrifice. It may also be what causes Luthen to make his final decision later on involving Cassian. But what did you read into that, Mike?
I got the impression that Luthen was affected by Marva's speech as well. As you said, you could see that it was affecting him in Skarsgård's performance. He was thinking deeply about the words that were being spoken, and I'm sure that he could feel the energy of the crowd as the tension grew. I think you are very well right that Luthen was feeling the power of Marva's speech and its ability to affect change. I also have to think that when Luthen cracked a smile at Cassian on the ship, he saw that in Marva's words, Cassian was no longer sleeping, and that's why he didn't kill him. There was no need anymore. Cassian was one of them. But I know you wanted to get into the riot, so why don't we do that?
I'd love to. Anyway, the riot that Marva inspires ends up playing straight into Cassian's hands because it gives him the cover he needs to slip in and rescue Bix. But it also causes the Empire to lose all sense of discipline because there's no consistent voice that takes command. It really should have been Dedra Meero taking charge, but she was walking alone in the streets looking for Cassian. In addition, there were Imperials who were looking for an excuse to start shooting, even wanting to kill Cassian against Dedra's orders. By the time the riot breaks out, Dedra's caught in the middle, and the other Imperial officers just decided to respond using overwhelming force. So there's no clear chain of command going on, and not much discipline within the Imperial ranks. So everything ends up descending into chaos, and the Empire is unable to maintain order within the city.
I'm actually curious how all of that will play out in the second season. There is no way the hammer isn't coming down on Ferrex, not after the public order resentencing decree. The planet of Ferrex is about to find out how the Empire deals with insurrectionists, is my guess. Also, Mira is definitely going to be punished for how things went down as well, as she is the senior officer on there, and it was her mission. The Empire is going to have to do something about this embarrassment, and I think the sun is about to set on Ferrex. There might even be some restructuring at the ISB after this. There really is no telling how far Palpatine will go, but let's move on.
Yeah, I definitely think Ferrex is going to pay for the riot next season, so you're likely going to be proven right there. But let's continue, as you say. So everyone manages to get away in the confusion, and Cassian successfully springs Bix from Imperial custody, with Cassian's friends making their way off planet. But Cassian decides not to go with them since he caught sight of Luthen's Hallcraft earlier in the episode. So Cassian decides to have a confrontation with Luthen aboard his Hallcraft. After a brief holdup where Cassian holds Luthen at gunpoint, Cassian offers to join him, finally realizing where his loyalties lie.
Actually, you bring up something I had mentioned I wanted to talk about earlier. I'm curious if you got the same vibe I did from Bix as Cassian was leaving the ship. When Bix said that she knew that Cassian would return for them, I didn't get the usual, I believe what she said vibe from that. My first thought was that Bix is force sensitive and perhaps she could see Cassian's return for them. Yoda was able to see into the future, though he understood that the force prophecy was not absolute and that the future was always in motion. His visions led him to foresee the fall of the Jedi in the Clone Wars and even his own death. So while she is no Yoda, I'm not saying that. What did you think about that? Did you pick up on that, or am I way off on this?
It's an interesting theory, but I'm not convinced that Bix is force sensitive. I mean, not least because it throws off the tone that Andor is going for. I got the sense that it was more that Bix has this deep bond with Cassian, and she just emotionally felt deep down that he wouldn't abandon her. She may have sensed the good in Cassian, I mean, the rebel that was sleeping within him, and it may even be that she built that hope inside her as a way of coping through the torture that she suffered. I personally wouldn't read too much into that line, though it's always possible I could turn out to be wrong.
It would go against the tone, and there really isn't any evidence to support that theory. I just felt like there was a knowing in her statement rather than just believing.
Hmm.
So there is a better chance that I'm wrong there. But I believe you had some more to say about a different character, didn't you?
I did. So let's turn back to Luthen for a moment. Luthen seems to have changed his mind on Cassian, apparently accepting his offer. Originally, the plan was seemingly to kill Cassian to cut out the loose end, but Luthen takes him along by the end of the season. Now, the interesting question is why Luthen would do this. Some of this is probably that Cassian was able to succeed in his mission on Ferrex and doing so without being noticed. That may have impressed him. But I can't help but wonder if Marva's speech also had an impact in the way Luthen sees Cassian. While Luthen is a very good planner, he's also very good at changing his plans and improvising with the situation as it unfolds. It may be that he finally started to see the potential that he saw in Cassian during their first meeting, but we're probably not going to know Luthen's full reasons until season 2. Mike, did you have any ideas on why Luthen might have changed his mind?
I think I agree with what you said there. I think that in their first meeting, Cassian was still sleeping in keeping with Marva's speech. But after what Cassian was able to accomplish on Ferrex, despite everyone looking for him, and that Cassian was there ready to die for the cause, Cassian had reached a point where he would rather die trying to stop them than die giving them what they want. And Luthen could see that in his eyes.
It sure seems that way. Luthen may have realized that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, as they say. He may have seen Marva's influence on him. But I think that covers our discussion of the story. So why don't we talk about some trivia? I think you had something you wanted to mention?
There is one bit of trivia I wanted to share before we wrap up. It takes a keen eye to spot them, but there are several Easter eggs in Luthen's gallery on Coruscant, including items from the Indiana Jones franchise, Frozen and
Hmm.
Carbonite. How cool is that? And various artifacts from the wider Star Wars universe. But what do you say we get into our final thoughts on the series, Steve?
That is awesome, and I'm going to have to go back to those scenes now. So, yeah, let's get into our final thoughts on Andor. I have to say, Andor ended up being a series that honestly surprised me. My initial impression, based on the first couple of episodes, was, if I'm honest. The first arc was a bit disjointed, and there were things that didn't quite connect right for me. But what impresses me about this season is that Andor constantly and consistently improves with each episode. The first episode setup was flawed, sure, but then you get into the Aldani raid, which is classic Rogue One, and by the time you get to the prison arc, you get to see what the show is really doing, and then it gets even better. I have quibbles about the finale, but I was still able to enjoy it, and by the end, I was looking forward to season 2. That teaser after the end credits with the Death Star promises a more concrete connection to Rogue One, and I'm looking forward to seeing how that plays out. But how about you, Mike? What are your general thoughts about Andor, and are you looking forward to season 2?
I really liked it. Not as much as Rogue One, but I noticed that both Rogue One and Andor get better with multiple viewings. I honestly needed to watch the series as a whole, and then each arc a couple of times to pick up everything because there's just so many new characters and situations and layers to absorb that there was just no other way for me to go about it. But every time I watched it again, I would pick up on things that just didn't occur to me before. I thought that Cassian's story arc was very good. Cassian's journey was a slow burn, and I think it should be. By the finale, Cassian crosses over from being a calculating schemer to a true rebel fighting for a greater good, namely by making saving his friends his top priority. In particular, I loved all of the world building in the series. What's more is I really think that Andor is an essential show in the Star Wars canon, and I'm absolutely looking forward to the next season.
Yeah, I feel like Andor is getting up there for me as well. I mean, it easily holds up well against the other live action shows, and only Mando really gives it a really strong competition for me. Cassian is growing on me as a character, and Luthen has become a favorite of mine as well. It's not as good as Rogue One, I agree, but it's definitely a great show and one worth checking out. So that's the end of our two-part coverage of Rogue One and Andor for our May the 4th episodes. Star Wars is one of my biggest passions, and it's been fun talking about the series with Mike. Hopefully, you've enjoyed this discussion as well, and feel free to hit us up with your own thoughts on the series. So until next time, thank you all for listening, and thanks to all our patrons who made this podcast possible.